With the Old Breed, Disc 3.
Our level of training rose in August, and so did the intensity of chicken discipline. We suffered through an increasing number of weapons and equipment inspections, work parties, and petty cleanup details around the camp. The step-up in harassment, coupled with the constant discomforts and harsh living conditions of Pavuvu, drove us all into a state of intense exasperation and disgust with our existence before we embarked for Peleliu. I used to think the lieutenant was a pretty good Joe, but damned if I ain't about decided he ain't nothing but a hoss's ass, grumbled one Marine. You said that right, old buddy, came back another. Hell, he ain't the only one that's gone crazy over insisting that everything be just so and then bawling us out if it ain't. The gunny's mean as hell, and nothing suits him anymore, responded yet another man. Don't let it get you down, boys. It's just part of the USMC plan for keeping the troops in fighting shape, calmly remarked a philosophical old salt of pre-war service. What the hell are you talking about? Snapped an irritated listener. Well, it's this way, answered the philosopher. If they get us mad enough, they figure we'll take it out on the nips when we hit this beach coming up. I saw it happen before, Guadalcanal and Gloucester. They don't pull this kind of stuff on rear echelon, boys. They want us to be mean, mad, and malicious. That's straight dope, I'm telling you. I've seen it happen every time before we go on a campaign. Sounds logical. You may be right, but what's malicious? Someone said. Forget it, you nitwit, the philosopher growled. Right or not, I'm sure tired of Pavuvu, I said. That's the plan, Sledgehammer. Get you fed up with Pavuvu or whatever the hell you happen to be, and you'll be hot to go anywhere else, even if the nips are there waiting for you, the philosopher said. We fell silent, thinking about that, and finally concluded he was right. Many of the more thoughtful men I knew shared his view. I griped as loudly as anyone about our living conditions and discipline. In retrospect, however, I doubt seriously whether I could have coped with the psychological and physical shock and stress encountered on Peleliu and Okinawa had it been otherwise. The Japanese fought to win. It was a savage, brutal, inhumane, exhausting, and dirty business. Our commanders knew that if we were to win and survive, we must be trained realistically for it, whether we liked it or not. In the post-war years, the Marine Corps came in for a great deal of undeserved criticism, in my opinion, from well-meaning persons who did not comprehend the magnitude of stress and horror that combat can be. The technology that developed the rifled barrel, the machine gun, and high-explosive shells has turned war into prolonged, subhuman slaughter. Men must be trained realistically if they are to survive it, without breaking, mentally and physically. Chapter 3. On to Peleliu. In late August, we completed our training. About the 26th, Company K boarded LST, landing ship Tank 661, for a voyage that would end 3 weeks later on the beach at Peleliu. LSTs were a class of shallow draft amphibious ships developed just before World War II. An LST could drive its front end directly onto a beach and then unload its cargo of vehicles through the large clamshell doors that formed the ship's bow when closed. Or, as in the case at Peleliu, LSTs could debark troop-carrying assault amphibians, Amtraks, at sea. Advanced models of the LST serve the American fleet today. Each rifle company assigned to the assault waves against Peleliu made the trip in an LST carrying the Amtraks that would take the men ashore. Our LST lacked sufficient troop compartment space to accommodate all of the men of the company, so the platoon leaders drew straws for the available space. The mortar section got lucky. We were assigned to a troop compartment in the forecastle, with an entrance on the main deck. Some of the other platoons had to make themselves as comfortable as possible on the main deck, under and around landing boats and gear secured there. Once loaded, we weighed anchor and headed straight for Guadalcanal, where the division held maneuvers in the Tassafaronga area. This area bore little resemblance to the beaches we would have to hit on Peleliu, but we spent several days in large and small unit amphibious landing exercises. Some of our Guadalcanal veterans wanted to visit the island cemetery to pay their respects to buddies killed during the division's first campaign. The veterans I knew were not allowed to make the trip to the cemetery, and there was a great deal of understandable bitterness and resentment on their part because of this. Between training exercises, some of us explored the beach area and looked over the stranded wrecks of Japanese landing barges, the troop ship Yamazuki Maru, and a two-man submarine. One of the Guadalcanal veterans told us what a helpless feeling it had been to sit back in the hills and watch Japanese reinforcements come ashore unopposed during the dark days of the campaign, when the Japanese Navy was so powerful in the Solomon Islands. Evidence of earlier fighting remained in the goodly number of shattered trees and several human skeletons we found in the jungle growth. We also had our lighter moments. When the Amtraks returned us to the LST each afternoon, we hurried to our quarters, stowed our gear, stripped, and went below to the tank deck. After all the Amtraks were aboard, the ship's CO, commanding officer, obligingly left the bow doors open and the ramp down so we could swim in the blue waters of Sea Lark Channel, called, more appropriately, Iron Bottom Bay, because of all the ships that had been sunk there during the Guadalcanal campaign. We dove, swam, and splashed in the beautiful water like a bunch of little boys, and for a few fleeting hours forgot why we were there. The 30 LSTs carrying the 1st Marine Division's assault companies finally weighed anchor early on the morning of 4 September to make the approximately 2,100-mile voyage to Peleliu. The trip proved to be uneventful. The sea was smooth, and we ran into rain squalls only once or twice. After chow each morning, several of us went aft to the ship's fantail to watch Gunnery Sergeant Haney's show. Dressed in khaki shorts, boondockers, and leggings, Haney went through his ritual of bayonet drill and rifle cleaning. He kept the scabbard on his bayonet and used a canvas-covered stanchion running down from the ship's superstructure as his target. It was a poor substitute for a moving parry stick, but Haney didn't let that stop him. For about an hour he went through his routine, complete with monologue, while dozens of Company K men lounged around on coils of rope and other gear, smoking and talking. Sometimes a spirited game of pinochle went on almost under his feet. He was as oblivious of the players as they were of him. Occasionally a sailor would come by and stare in disbelief at Haney. Several asked me if he were Asiatic. Not being able to overcome the temptation to kid them a bit, I told them no, he was just typical of our outfit. Then they would stare at me as they had at Haney. I always had the feeling that sailors looked on Marine infantrymen as though we were a bit crazy, wild, or reckless. Maybe we were, but maybe we had to develop a don't-give-a-damn attitude to keep our sanity in the face of what we were about to endure. In the ranks, we knew little about the nature of the island that was our objective. During a training lecture on Pavuvu, we learned that Peleliu must be taken to secure General Douglas MacArthur's right flank for his invasion of the Philippines, and that it had a good airfield that could support MacArthur. I don't recall when we heard the name of the island, although we viewed relief maps and models during lectures. It had a nice-sounding name, Peleliu. Although our letters from Pavuvu were carefully censored, our officers apparently feared taking a chance on some character writing in code to someone back home that we were to hit an island named Peleliu. As a buddy said to me later, however, no one back home would have known where to look for it on a map anyway. The Palaus, the westernmost part of the Caroline Islands chain, consist of several large islands and more than 100 smaller ones. Except for Ungaur in the south and a couple of small atolls in the north, the whole group lies within an encircling coral reef. About 500 miles to the west lie the southern Philippines. To the south, at about the same distance, is New Guinea. Peleliu, just inside the Palau Reef, is shaped like a lobster's claw, extending 2 arms of land. The southern arm reaches northeastward from flat ground to form a jumble of coral islets and tidal flats, overgrown thickly with mangroves. The longer northern arm is dominated by the parallel coral ridges of Brogel Mountain. North to south, the island is about 6 miles long, with a width of approximately 2 miles. On the wide, largely flat southern section, the Japanese had constructed an airfield shaped roughly like the numeral 4. The ridges and most of the island outside the airfield were thickly wooded. There were only occasional patches of wild palms and open grass areas. The thick scrub so completely masked the true nature of the terrain that aerial photographs and pre-D-Day photos taken by United States submarines gave intelligence officers no hint of its ruggedness. The treacherous reef along the landing beaches and the heavily defended coral ridges inland made the invasion of Peleliu a combination of the problems of Tarawa and of Saipan. The reef, over 600 yards long, was the most formidable natural obstacle. Because of it, troops and equipment making the assault had to be transported in Amtraks. Higgins boats could not negotiate across the rough coral and the varying depths of water. Before leaving Pavuvu, we had been told that the 1st Marine Division would be reinforced to about 28,000 men for the assault on Peleliu. As every man in the ranks knew, however, a lot of those people included in the term reinforced were neither trained nor equipped as combat troops. They were specialists attached to the division to implement the landing and supply by working on ships and later on the beaches. They would not be doing the fighting. Upon sailing for Peleliu, the 1st Marine Division numbered 16,459 officers and men. A rear echelon of 1,771 remained on Pavuvu. Of these, only about 9,000 were infantrymen in the 3 infantry regiments. Intelligence sources estimated that we would face more than 10,000 Japanese defenders on Peleliu. The big topic of conversation among us troops had to do with those comparative strengths. "Hey, you guys, the lieutenant just told me that the 1st Division is going to be the biggest Marine division to ever make a landing. He says we got reinforcements we never had before." A veteran looked up from cleaning his .45 automatic and said, "Boy, has that shaved-tail lieutenant been smokestacking you." "Why?" "Use your head, buddy. Sure, we got the 1st Marines, the 5th Marines, and the 7th Marines. Them's infantry. The 11th Marines is our division artillery. Where the hell's all them people who is supposed to reinforce the division? Have you seen 'em? Who the hell are they? And where the hell are they?" "I don't know. I'm just telling you what the lieutenant said." "Well, I'll tell you who them reinforcements is. That's all what they call specialists. They ain't line company Marines. Remember this, Buster. When the stuff hits the fan and you and me are trying to live through that shootin' and the shellin', them damn specialists will be settin' on they cans back at Division CP, command post, on the beach, writin' home about how war is hell. And who is going to have all the casualties and lose all the men fighting the nips? The 1st Marines, the 5th Marines, and the 7th Marines will all catch hell, and the 11th Marines will lose some men, too. Wake up, boy. Them shave-tail lieutenants is as useless as tits on a boar hog. The NCOs run things when the shooting starts. During World War II, amphibious planners considered the safe ratio of attackers to defenders in an amphibious assault to be 3-to-1. To the leaders at Peleliu, the total Marine force of 30,000 provided a safe margin over the Japanese, although at least one regimental commander, the redoubtable Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller, pointed out the disparity in actual combat forces. The division's commander, Major General William H. Rupertus, and his staff believed his fears were groundless. D-1. After evening chow on 14 September 1944, a buddy and I leaned against the rail of LST 661 and talked about what we would do after the war. I tried to appear unconcerned about the next day, and he did too. We may have fooled each other and ourselves a little, but not much. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and its glare no longer reflected off a glassy sea, I thought of how beautiful the sunsets always were in the Pacific. They were even more beautiful than over Mobile Bay. Suddenly a thought hit me like a thunderbolt. Would I live to see the sunset tomorrow? My knees nearly buckled as panic swept over me. I squeezed the railing and tried to appear interested in our conversation. The ships in the convoy turned into dark hulks, gliding along as the squawk box interrupted our conversation. "Now hear this, now hear this." Talking quietly in pairs and small groups, the men around us seemed to pay more than the usual attention to the command. "All troops lay below to quarters. All troops lay below to quarters." My buddy and I went to our forecastle compartment. One of our NCOs sent a work party to another compartment to draw rations and ammunition. After it returned, our lieutenant came in, gave us at ease, and said he had some things to say. His brow was knit, his face drawn, and he looked worried. "Men, as you probably know, tomorrow is D-Day. General Rupertus says the fighting will be extremely tough but short. It will be over in 4 days, maybe 3. A fight like Tarawa. It's going to be rough, but fast. Then we can return to a rest area. Remember what you've been taught. Keep your heads down going in on the Amtrak. A lot of unnecessary casualties at Saipan were the result of men looking over the side to see what was happening. As soon as the Amtrak stops on the beach, get out on the double and get off the beach fast. Keep out of the way of the Amtraks on their way back out to pick up more troops from the supporting waves. Our tanks will be coming in behind us, too. The drivers have their hands full and can't dodge around the infantry, so you keep out of their way. Get off the beach fast. The Japs will plaster it with everything they've got, and if we get pinned down on the beach, artillery and mortars will ruin us. Have your weapons ready because the Japs always try to stop us at the beach line. They may meet us at the beach with bayonets as soon as our naval gunfire barrage lifts and moves inland. So come out of the Amtraks ready for anything. Have a round in the chamber of your small arms and lock your pieces. Snap on the safety. Have the canister containers of your high-explosive mortar rounds untaped and stowed in your ammo bags ready for immediate use as soon as we are called on to deliver fire on the company front. Fill your canteens, draw rations and salt tablets, and clean your weapons. Reveille will be before daylight, and H hour will be 0830. Hit the sack early. You will need the rest. Good luck, and carry on. He left the compartment, and the NCOs issued us ammo, K-rations, and salt tablets. "Well," said one man, That scuttlebutt we heard during maneuvers on Guadalcanal about how this blitz gonna be rough but fast must be true if the Division CG says so." "San Antone," muttered a Texan. "Imagine, only 4, maybe 3 days for a battle star. Hell, I can put up with anything for no longer than that." He reflected the feelings of most of us, and we were encouraged by the commanding general's announcement confirming the oft-repeated, rough but fast, rumors we had been hearing. In a sealed letter, opened D-Day-1 by civilian news correspondents assigned to cover the battle, Major General William H. Rupertus predicted that Peleliu would fall in 4 days after a short, tough fight. His forecast colored the tactical thinking ashore for much of the next month. Because of his optimism, many of the 36 newsmen never went ashore. Of those who did, only 6 stayed through the critical early stages of the battle. Thus, the medium's eyes saw little of what actually happened. We kept trying to convince ourselves that the CG knew what he was talking about. We all dreaded a long, protracted campaign that would drag on beyond endurance, like Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. Our morale was excellent, and we were trained for anything, no matter how rough. But we prayed that we could get it over with in a hurry. We sat on our sacks, cleaned our weapons, packed our combat packs, and squared away our gear. Throughout history, combat troops of various armies have carried packs weighing many pounds into action, but we traveled light, carrying only absolute necessities, the way fast-moving Confederate infantry did during the Civil War. My combat pack contained a folded poncho, 1 pair of socks, a couple of boxes of K rations, salt tablets, extra carbine ammo, 20 rounds, 2 hand grenades, a fountain pen, a small bottle of ink, writing paper in a waterproof wrapper, a toothbrush, a small tube of toothpaste, some photos of my folks along with some letters in a waterproof wrapper, and a dungaree cap. My other equipment and clothing were a steel helmet covered with a camouflaged cloth covering, heavy green dungaree jacket with a Marine emblem, and USMC dyed above it on the left breast pocket, trousers of the same material, an old toothbrush for cleaning my carbine, thin cotton socks, ankle-high boondockers, and light tan canvas leggings, into which I tucked my trouser legs. Because of the heat, I wore no skivvy drawers or shirt. Like many men, I fastened a bronze Marine emblem to one collar for good luck. Attached to my Webb pistol belt, I carried a pouch containing a combat dressing, 2 canteens, a pouch with 2 15-round carbine magazines, clips we called them, and a fine brass compass in a waterproof case. My K-bar hung in its leather sheath on my right side. Hooked over the belt by its spoon handle, I carried a grenade. I also had a heavy-bladed knife, similar to a meat cleaver, that my dad had sent me. I used this to chop through the wire braces wrapped around the stout crates of 60mm mortar shells. On the stock of my carbine, I fastened an ammo pouch with 2 extra clips. I carried no bayonet because the model carbine I had lacked a bayonet lug. Onto the outside of my pack, I hooked my entrenching tool in its canvas cover. The tool proved useless on Peleliu because of the hard coral. All officers and men dressed much the same. The main differences among us were in the type of web belt worn and the individual weapon carried. We tried to appear unconcerned and talked about anything but the war. Some wrote last letters. "What are you going to do after the war, Sledgehammer?" asked a buddy sitting across from me. He was an extremely intelligent and intellectually active young man. "I don't know, Oswald. What are you planning to do?" "I want to be a brain surgeon. The human brain is an incredible thing. It fascinates me," he replied. But he didn't survive Peleliu to realize his ambition. Slowly, the conversations trailed off, and the men hit the sack. It was hard to sleep that night. I thought of home, my parents, my friends, and whether I would do my duty, be wounded and disabled, or be killed. I concluded that it was impossible for me to be killed, because God loved me. Then I told myself that God loved us all, and that many would die or be ruined physically or mentally, or both, by the next morning, and in the days following. My heart pounded, and I broke out in a cold sweat. Finally, I called myself a damned coward, and eventually fell asleep, saying the Lord's Prayer to myself. D-Day, 15 September, 1944. I seemed to have slept only a short time when an NCO came into the compartment saying, "Okay, you guys, hit the deck." I felt the ship had slowed and almost stopped. If only I could hold back the hands of the clock, I thought. It was pitch dark with no lights topside. We tumbled out, dressed and shaved, and got ready for chow. Steak and eggs, a 1st Marine Division tradition, honoring a culinary combination learned from the Australians. Neither the steak nor the eggs was very palatable, though. My stomach was tied in knots. Back in my compartment, a peculiar problem had developed. Haney, who had been one of the first to return from chow about 45 minutes earlier, had ensconced himself on the seat of one of the 2 toilets in the small head on our side of the compartment. There he sat, dungaree trousers down to his knees, his beloved leggings laced neatly over his boondockers, grinning and talking calmly to himself while smoking a cigarette. Nervous Marines lined up using the other toilet, one after another. Some men had been to the head on the other side of the compartment, while others, in desperation, dashed off to the heads in other troop compartments. The facilities in our compartment normally were adequate, but D-Day morning found us all nervous, tense, and afraid. The veterans already knew what I was to find out. During periods of intense fighting, a man might not have the opportunity to eat or sleep, much less move his bowels. All the men grumbled and scowled at Haney, but because he was a gunnery sergeant, no one dared suggest he hurry. With his characteristic detachment, Haney ignored us, remained unhurried, and left when he pleased. The first light of dawn was just appearing as I left my gear on my bunk, all squared away and ready to put on, and went out onto the main deck. All the men were talking quietly, smoking, and looking toward the island. I found Snafu and stayed close by him. Corporal Merrill A. Snafu Shelton came from Louisiana. He was the gunner on our mortar, so we stuck together. He was also a Gloucester veteran, and I felt more secure around veterans. They knew what to expect. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes and drawled, "Have a smoke, Sledgehammer?" "No, thanks, Snafu. I told you 1,000,000 times I don't smoke." "I'll bet you 2 bits, Sledgehammer, that before this day is over, you'll be smoking the hell out of every cigarette you can get your hands on." I just gave him a sickly grin, and we looked toward the island. The sun was just coming up, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The sea was calm. A gentle breeze blew. A ship's bell rang, and over the squawk box came, "Get your gear on and stand by." Snafu and I hurried to our bunks, nodding and speaking to other grim-faced buddies who were rushing to get their gear. In the crowded compartment, we helped each other with packs, straightened shoulder straps, and buckled on cartridge belts. Generals and admirals might worry about maps and tons of supplies, but my main concern at the moment was how my pack straps felt and whether my boondockers were comfortable. The next bell rang. Snafu picked up the 45 pounds of mortar and slung the carrying strap over his shoulder. I slung my carbine over one shoulder and the heavy ammo bag over the other. We filed down a ladder to the tank deck, where an NCO directed us to climb aboard an Amtrak. My knees got weak when I saw that it wasn't the newer model with the tailgate ramp for troop exit in which we had practiced. This meant that once the Amtrak was on the beach, we'd have to jump over the high sides, exposed much more to enemy fire. I was too scared and excited to say much, but some of the guys grumbled about it. The ship's bow doors opened and the ramp went down. All the tractor's engines roared and spewed out fumes. Exhaust fans whirred above us. Glaring daylight streamed into the tank deck through the open bow of the ship as the first Amtrak started out and clattered down the sloping ramp. Our machine started with a jerk, and we held onto the sides and to each other. The Amtrak's treads ground and scraped against the iron ridges on the ramp. Then it floated freely and settled onto the water like a big duck. Around us roared the voices of the ship's guns, engaged in the pre-assault bombardment of Peleliu's beaches and defensive positions. The Marine Corps had trained us new men until we were welded with the veterans into a thoroughly disciplined combat division. Now the force of events unleashed on that 2-mile by 6-mile piece of unfriendly coral rock would carry us forward unrelentingly, each to his individual fate. Everything my life had been before, and has been after, pales in the light of that awesome moment when my Amtrak started in amid a thunderous bombardment toward the flaming, smoke-shrouded beach for the assault on Peleliu. Since the end of World War II, historians and military analysts have argued inconclusively about the necessity of the Palau Islands campaign. Many believed after the battle, and still believe today, that the United States didn't need to fight it as a prerequisite to General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Admiral William F. Bull Halsey suggested calling off the Palau operation after high-level planners learned that Japanese air power in the Philippines wasn't as strong as intelligence originally had presumed it to be. But MacArthur believed the operation should proceed, and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz said it was too late to cancel the operation because the convoy was already underway. Because of important events in Europe at the time and the lack of immediate apparent benefits from the seizure of Peleliu, the battle remains one of the lesser known or understood of the Pacific War. Nonetheless, for many it ranks as the roughest fight the Marines had in World War II. Major General, later Lieutenant General, Roy S. Geiger, the rugged commander of the 3rd Amphibious Corps, said repeatedly that Peleliu was the toughest battle of the entire Pacific War. A former commandant of the Marine Corps, General Clifton B. Cates, said Peleliu was one of the most vicious and stubbornly contested battles of the war, and that nowhere was the fighting efficiency of the U.S. Marine demonstrated more convincingly. Peleliu also was important to the remainder of the Marines' war in the Pacific because of the changes in Japanese tactics encountered there. The Japanese abandoned their conventional all-out effort at defending the beach in favor of a complex defense based upon mutually supporting fortified positions in caves and pillboxes extending deeply into the interior of the island, particularly in the ridges of the Umurbrogel Mountain. In earlier battles, the Japanese had exhausted their forces in banzai charges against the Marines once the latter had firmly established a beachhead. The Marines slaughtered the wildly charging Japanese by the thousands. Not a single banzai charge had been successful for the Japanese in previous campaigns. But on Peleliu, the Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, let the Marines come to him and the approximately 10,000 troops of his proud 14th Infantry Division. From mutually supporting positions, the Japanese covered nearly every yard of Peleliu from the beach inland to the center of Nakagawa's command post, deep beneath the coral rock in the center of the ridge system. Some positions were large enough to hold only one man. Some caves held hundreds. Thus, the Marines encountered no one main defense line. The Japanese had constructed the perfect defense in depth, with the whole island as a front line. They fought until the last position was knocked out. Aided by the incredibly rugged terrain, the new Japanese tactics proved so successful that the 1st Marine Division suffered more than twice as many casualties on Peleliu as the 2nd Marine Division had on Tarawa. Proportionately, United States casualties on Peleliu closely approximated those suffered later on Iwo Jima, where the Japanese again employed an intricate defense in depth, conserved forces, and fought a battle of attrition. On an even greater scale, the skillful, tenacious defense of the southern portion of Okinawa used the same sophisticated, in-depth defensive system first tested on Peleliu. Chapter 4. Assault into Hell. H-hour, 0800. Long jets of red flame mixed with thick black smoke rushed out of the muzzles of the huge battleship's 16-inch guns with a noise like a thunderclap. The giant shells tore through the air toward the island, roaring like locomotives. "Boy, it must cost a fortune to fire them 16-inch babies," said a buddy near me. "Screw the expense," growled another. Only less impressive were the cruisers firing 8-inch salvos and a host of smaller ships firing rapid fire. The usually clean, salty air was strong with the odors of explosives and diesel fuel. While the assault waves formed up and my amphibious tractor lay still in the water with engines idling, the tempo of the bombardment increased to such intensity that I couldn't distinguish the reports of the various types of weapons through the thunderous noise. We had to shout at each other to be heard. The big ships increased their fire and moved off to the flanks of the Amtrak formations when we started in, so as not to fire over us at the risk of short rounds. We waited a seeming eternity for the signal to start toward the beach. The suspense was almost more than I could bear. Waiting is a major part of war, but I never experienced any more supremely agonizing suspense than the excruciating torture of those moments before we received the signal to begin the assault on Peleliu. I broke out in a cold sweat as the tension mounted with the intensity of the bombardment. My stomach was tied in knots. I had a lump in my throat and swallowed only with great difficulty. My knees nearly buckled, so I clung weakly to the side of the tractor. I felt nauseated and feared that my bladder would surely empty itself and reveal me to be the coward I was. But the men around me looked just about the way I felt. Finally, with a sense of fatalistic relief mixed with a flash of anger at the Navy officer who was our wave commander, I saw him wave his flag toward the beach. Our driver revved the engine. The treads churned up the water, and we started in, the second wave ashore. We moved ahead, watching the frightful spectacle. Huge geysers of water rose around the Amtraks ahead of us as they approached the reef. The beach was now marked along its length by a continuous sheet of flame, backed by a thick wall of smoke. It seemed as though a huge volcano had erupted from the sea, and rather than heading for an island, we were being drawn into the vortex of a flaming abyss. For many, it was to be oblivion. The lieutenant braced himself and pulled out a half-pint whiskey bottle. "This is it, boys," he yelled. Just like they do it in the movies. It seemed unreal. He held the bottle out to me, but I refused. Just sniffing the cork under those conditions might have made me pass out. He took a long pull on the bottle, and a couple of the men did the same. Suddenly, a large shell exploded with a terrific concussion, and a huge geyser rose up just to our right front. It barely missed us. The engine stalled. The front of the tractor lurched to the left and bumped hard against the rear of another Amtrak that was either stalled or hit. I never knew which. We sat, stalled, floating in the water for some terrifying moments. We were sitting ducks for the enemy gunners. I looked forward through the hatch behind the driver. He was wrestling frantically with the control levers. Japanese shells were screaming into the air and exploding all around us. Sergeant Johnny Marmot leaned toward the driver and yelled something. Whatever it was, it seemed to calm the driver, because he got the engine started. We moved forward again amid the geysers of exploding shells. Our bombardment began to lift off the beach and move inland. Our dive bombers also moved inland with their strafing and bombing. The Japanese increased the volume of their fire against the waves of Amtraks. Above the din, I could hear the ominous sound of shell fragments humming and growling through the air. "Stand by," someone yelled. I picked up my mortar ammo bag and slung it over my left shoulder, buckled my helmet chin strap, adjusted my carbine sling over my right shoulder, and tried to keep my balance. My heart pounded. Our Amtrak came out of the water and moved a few yards up the gently sloping sand. "Hit the beach!" yelled an NCO moments before the machine lurched to a stop. The men piled over the sides as fast as they could. I followed Snafu, climbed up and planted both feet firmly on the left side so as to leap as far away from it as possible. At that instant, a burst of machine gun fire with white-hot tracers snapped through the air at eye level, almost grazing my face. I pulled my head back like a turtle, lost my balance, and fell awkwardly forward down onto the sand in a tangle of ammo bag, pack, helmet, carbine, gas mask, cartridge belt, and flopping canteens. "Get off the beach! Get off the beach!" raced through my mind. Once I felt land under my feet, I wasn't as scared as I had been coming across the reef. My legs dug up the sand as I tried to rise. A firm hand gripped my shoulder. "Oh, God," I thought, "it's a nip who's come out of a pillbox." I couldn't reach my K-bar. Fortunately, because as I got my face out of the sand and looked up, there was the worried face of a Marine bending over me. He thought the machine gun burst had hit me, and he had crawled over to help. When he saw I was unhurt, he spun around and started crawling rapidly off the beach. I scuttled after him. Shells crashed all around. Fragments tore and whirred, slapping on the sand and splashing into the water a few yards behind us. The Japanese were recovering from the shock of our pre-landing bombardment. Their machine gun and rifle fire got thicker, snapping viciously overhead in increasing volume. Our Amtrak spun around and headed back out as I reached the edge of the beach and flattened on the deck. The world was a nightmare of flashes, violent explosions, and snapping bullets. Most of what I saw blurred. My mind was benumbed by the shock of it. I glanced back across the beach and saw a duck, a DUKW, rubber-tired amphibious truck, roll up on the sand at a point near where we had just landed. The instant the duck stopped, it was engulfed in thick, dirty black smoke as a shell scored a direct hit on it. Bits of debris flew into the air. I watched with that odd, detached fascination peculiar to men under fire, as a flat metal panel about 2 feet square spun high into the air, then splashed into shallow water like a big pancake. I didn't see any men get out of the duck. Up and down the beach and out on the reef, a number of Amtraks and ducks were burning. Japanese machine gun bursts made long splashes in the water as though flaying it with some giant whip. The geysers belched up relentlessly where the mortar and artillery shells hit. I caught a fleeting glimpse of a group of Marines leaving a smoking Amtrak on the reef. Some fell as bullets and fragments splashed among them. Their buddies tried to help them as they struggled in the knee-deep water. I shuddered and choked. A wild, desperate feeling of anger, frustration, and pity gripped me. It was an emotion that always would torture my mind when I saw men trapped and was unable to do anything but watch as they were hit. My own plight forgotten momentarily, I felt sickened to the depths of my soul. I asked God, why? I turned my face away and wished that I were imagining it all. I had tasted the bitterest essence of war, the sight of helpless comrades being slaughtered, and it filled me with disgust. I got up. Crouching low, I raced up the sloping beach into a defilade. Reaching the inland edge of the sand just beyond the high water mark, I glanced down and saw the nose of a huge black and yellow bomb protruding from the sand. A metal plate attached to the top served as a pressure trigger. My foot had missed it by only inches. I hit the deck again just inside the defilade. On the sand immediately in front of me was a dead snake about 18 inches long. It was colorful, somewhat like American species I had kept as pets when I was a boy. It was the only snake I saw on Peleliu. Momentarily, I was out of the heavy fire hitting on the beach. A strong smell of chemicals and exploding shells filled the air. Patches of coral and sand around me were yellowed from the powder from shell blasts. A large white post about 4 feet high stood at the edge of the defilade. Japanese writing was painted on the side facing the beach. To me, it appeared as though a chicken with muddy feet had walked up and down the post. I felt a sense of pride that this was enemy territory and that we were capturing it for our country to help win the war. One of our NCOs signaled us to move to our right out of the shallow defilade. I was glad because the Japanese probably would pour mortar fire into it to prevent it being used for shelter. At the moment, however, the gunners seemed to be concentrating on the beach and the incoming waves of Marines. I ran over to where one of our veterans stood looking to our front and flopped down at his feet. "You better get down," I yelled as bullets snapped and cracked all around. "Them slugs are high. They're hidden in the leaves, Sledgehammer," he said nonchalantly without looking at me. "Leaves, hell! Where are the trees?" I yelled back at him. Startled, he looked right and left. Down the beach, barely visible, was a shattered palm. Nothing near us stood over knee-high. He hit the deck. "I must be cracking up, Sledgehammer. Them slugs sound just like they did in the jungle at Gloucester, and I figured they were hitting leaves," he said with chagrin. "Somebody give me a cigarette," I yelled to my squad mates nearby. Snafu was jubilant. "I told you you'd start smoking, didn't I, Sledgehammer?" A buddy handed me a smoke, and with trembling hands we got it lit. They really kidded me about going back on all my previous refusals to smoke. I kept looking to our right, expecting to see men from the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, 3-7, which was supposed to be there. But I saw only the familiar faces of Marines from my own company as we moved off the beach. Marines began to come in behind us in increasing numbers, but none were visible on our right flank. Unfamiliar officers and NCOs yelled and shouted orders. "K Company, 1st Platoon, move over here," or "K Company, mortar section, over here." Considerable confusion prevailed for about 15 minutes as our officers and the leaders from our namesake company and the 7th Marines straightened out the two units. From left to right, along the 2,200-yard beach front, the 1st Marines, the 5th Marines, and the 7th Marines landed abreast. The 1st Marines landed 1 battalion on each of the 2 northern white beaches. In the division's center, the 5th Marines landed its 1st Battalion, 1-5, over Orange Beach 1, and its 3rd Battalion, 3-5, over Orange Beach 2. Forming the right flank of the division, the 7th Marines was to land 1 battalion, 3-7, in the assault over Orange Beach 3, the southernmost of 5 designated beaches. In the confusion of the landing's first few minutes, K-35 actually got in ahead of the assault companies of 3-7, and slightly farther to the right than intended. As luck would have it, the 2 companies got mixed together as the right flank of the division. For about 15 minutes, we were the exposed right flank of the entire beachhead. We started to move inland. We had gone only a few yards when an enemy machine gun opened up from a scrub thicket to our right. Japanese 81mm and 90mm mortars then opened up on us. Everyone hit the deck. I dove into a shallow crater. The company was completely pinned down. All movement ceased. The shells fell faster until I couldn't make out individual explosions, just continuous crashing rumbles, with an occasional ripping sound of shrapnel tearing low through the air overhead amid the roar. The air was murky with smoke and dust. Every muscle in my body was as tight as a piano wire. I shuddered and shook as though I were having a mild convulsion. Sweat flowed profusely. I prayed, clenched my teeth, squeezed my carbine stock, and cursed the Japanese. Our lieutenant, a Cape Gloucester veteran who was nearby, seemed to be in about the same shape. From the meager protection of my shallow crater, I pitied him or anyone out on that flat coral. The heavy mortar barrage went on without slackening. I thought it would never stop. I was terrified by the big shells arching down all around us. One was bound to fall directly into my hole, I thought. If any orders were passed along, or if anyone yelled for a corpsman, I never heard it in all the noise. It was as though I was out there on the battlefield all by myself, utterly forlorn and helpless in a tempest of violent explosions. All any man could do was sweat it out and pray for survival. It would have been sure suicide to stand up in that firestorm. Under my first barrage since the fast-moving events of hitting the beach, I learned a new sensation: utter and absolute helplessness. The shelling lifted in about half an hour, although it seemed to me to have crashed on for hours. Time had no meaning to me. This was particularly true when under a heavy shelling. I could never judge how long it lasted. Orders then came to move out, and I got up covered by a layer of coral dust. I felt like jelly and couldn't believe any of us had survived that barrage. The walking wounded began coming past us on their way to the beach, where they would board Amtraks to be taken out to one of the ships. An NCO, who was a particular friend of mine, hurried by, holding a bloody battle dressing over his upper left arm. "Hit bad?" I yelled. His face lit up in a broad grin, and he said jauntily, "Don't feel sorry for me, Sledgehammer. I got the $1 million wound. It's all over for me." We waved as he hurried on out of the war. We had to be alert constantly as we moved through the thick sniper-infested scrub. We received orders to halt in an open area as I came upon the first enemy dead I had ever seen: a dead Japanese medical corpsman and 2 riflemen. The medic apparently had been trying to administer aid when he was killed by one of our shells. His medical chest lay open beside him, and the various bandages and medicines were arranged neatly in compartments. The corpsman was on his back, his abdominal cavity laid bare. I stared in horror, shocked at the glistening viscera bespecked with fine coral dust. This can't have been a human being, I agonized. It looked more like the guts of one of the many rabbits or squirrels I had cleaned on hunting trips as a boy. I felt sick as I stared at the corpses. A sweating, dusty Company K veteran came up, looked first at the dead and then at me. He slung his M1 rifle over his shoulder and leaned over the bodies. With the thumb and forefinger of one hand, he deftly plucked a pair of horn-rimmed glasses from the face of the corpsman. This was done as casually as a guest plucking an hors d'oeuvre from a tray at a cocktail party. "Sledgehammer," he said reproachfully, "don't stand there with your mouth open when there's all these good souvenirs laying around." He held the glasses for me to see and added, "Look how thick that glass is. These sons of bitches must be half blind, but it don't seem to mess up their marksmanship any." He then removed a Nambu pistol, slipped the belt off the corpse, and took the leather holster. He pulled off the steel helmet, reached inside, and took out a neatly folded Japanese flag covered with writing. The veteran pitched the helmet on the coral where it clanked and rattled, rolled the corpse over, and started pawing through the combat pack. The veteran's buddy came up and started stripping the other Japanese corpses. His take was a flag and other items. He then removed the bolts from the Japanese rifles and broke the stocks against the coral to render them useless to infiltrators. The first veteran said, "See ya, Sledgehammer. Don't take any wooden nickels." He and his buddy moved on. I hadn't budged an inch or said a word, just stood glued to the spot, almost in a trance. The corpses were sprawled where the veterans had dragged them around to get into their packs and pockets. Would I become this casual and calloused about enemy dead? I wondered. Would the war dehumanize me so that I too could field strip enemy dead with such nonchalance? The time soon came when it didn't bother me a bit. Within a few yards of this scene, one of our hospital corpsmen worked in a small, shallow defile, treating Marine wounded. I went over and sat on the hot coral by him. The corpsman was on his knees, bending over a young Marine who had just died on a stretcher. A blood-soaked battle dressing was on the side of the dead man's neck. His fine, handsome, boyish face was ashen. What a pitiful waste, I thought. He can't be a day over 17 years old. I thank God his mother couldn't see him. The corpsman held the dead Marine's chin tenderly between the thumb and fingers of his left hand and made the sign of the cross with his right hand. Tears streamed down his dusty, tanned, grief-contorted face while he sobbed quietly. The wounded who had received morphine sat or lay around like zombies and patiently awaited the doc's attention. Shells roared overhead in both directions, an occasional one falling nearby, and machine guns rattled incessantly like chattering demons. We moved inland. The scrub may have slowed the company, but it concealed us from the heavy enemy shelling that was holding up other companies facing the open airfield. I could hear the deep rumble of the shelling and dreaded that we might move into it. That our battalion executive officer had been killed a few moments after hitting the beach, and that the Amtrak carrying most of our battalion's field telephone equipment and operators had been destroyed on the reef made control difficult. The companies of 3-5 lost contact with each other and with 3-7 on our right flank. Historical accounts of battles often leave a reader with the impression that the individual participants had a panoramic view of events. Such is not the case, however. Even the historians have never been able to piece together completely what happened to 3-5 on D-Day at Peleliu. As I passed the different units and exchanged greetings with friends, I was astonished at their faces. When I tried to smile at a comment a buddy made, my face felt as tight as a drumhead. My facial muscles were so tensed from the strain that I actually felt it was impossible to smile. With a shock, I realized that the faces of my squad mates and everyone around me looked mask-like and unfamiliar. As we pushed eastward, we halted briefly along a north-south trail. Word was passed that we had to move forward faster to a trail where we would come up abreast of 3-7. We continued through the thick scrub and heavy sniper fire until we came out into a clearing overlooking the ocean. Company K had reached the eastern shore. We had reached our objective. To our front was a shallow bay with barbed wire entanglements, iron tetrahedrons, and other obstacles against landing craft. I was glad we hadn't tried to invade this coast. About a dozen Company K riflemen commenced firing at Japanese soldiers wading along the reef several hundred yards away at the mouth of the bay. Other Marines joined us. The enemy were moving out from a narrow extension of the mangrove swamp on the left toward the southeastern promontory on our right. About a dozen enemy soldiers were alternately swimming and running along the reef. Some of the time only their heads were above the water, as my buddies sent rifle fire into their midst. Most of the running enemy went down with a splash. We were elated over reaching the eastern shore, at being able to fire on the enemy in the open. A few Japanese escaped and scrambled among the rocks on the promontory. "Okay, you guys, line 'em up and squeeze 'em off," said a sergeant. "You don't kill 'em with the noise, it's the slugs that do it. You guys couldn't hit a bull in the ass with a bass fiddle," he roared. Several more Japanese ran out from the cover of the mangroves. A burst of rifle fire sent every one of them splashing. "That's better," growled the sergeant. The mortarmen put down our loads and stood by to set up the guns. We didn't fire at the enemy with our carbines. Rifles were more effective than carbines at that range, so we just watched. Firing increased from our rear. We had no contact with Marine units on our right or left, but the veterans weren't concerned with anything but the enemy on the reef. "Stand by to move out," came the order. "What the hell?" grumbled the veteran as we headed back into the scrub. "We fight like hell and reach our objective, and they order us to fall back." Others joined in the grumbling. "Aw, knock it off. We gotta gain contact with the 7th Marines," an NCO said. We headed back into the thick scrub. For some time, I completely lost my bearings and had no idea where we were going. Unknown to the Marines, there were 2 parallel north-south trails, about 200 yards apart, winding through the thick scrub. Poor maps, poor visibility, and numerous snipers made it difficult to distinguish the 2 trails. When 3-5, with Company K on its right flank, reached the first westernmost trail, it was then actually abreast of 3-7. However, due to poor visibility, contact couldn't be made between the 2 battalions. It was thought 3-5 was too far to the rear, so 3-5 was ordered to move forward to come abreast of 3-7. By the time this error was realized, 3-5 had pushed 300 to 400 yards ahead of the 7th Marines' flank. For the second time on D-Day, K-35 was the forward-most exposed right flank element of the division. The entire 3rd Battalion 5th Marines formed a deep salient reaching into enemy territory to the east coast. To make matters worse, the battalion's 3 companies had lost contact with each other. These isolated units were in critical danger of being cut off and surrounded by the Japanese. The weather was getting increasingly hot, and I was soaked with sweat. I began eating salt tablets and taking frequent drinks of tepid water from my canteens. We were warned to save our water as long as possible, because no one knew when we would get any more. A sweating runner with a worried face came up from the rear. "Hey, you guys, where's K Company's CO?" he asked. We told him where we thought Ack could be located. "What's the hot dope?" someone asked, with that same anxious question always put to runners. "Battalion CP says we just got to establish contact with the 7th Marines, because if the Nips counterattack, they'll come right through the gap," he said as he hurried on. "Jesus," said a man near me. We moved forward and came up with the rest of the company in a clearing. The platoons formed up and took casualty reports. Japanese mortar and artillery fire increased. The shelling became heavy, indicating the probability of a counterattack. Most of their fire whistled over us and fell to our rear. This seemed strange, although fortunate to me at the time. The order came for us to move out a short distance to the edge of the scrub. At approximately 1650, I looked out across the open airfield toward the southern extremities of the Coral Ridges, collectively called Bloody Nose Ridge, and saw vehicles of some sort moving amid swirling clouds of dust. "Hey," I said to a veteran next to me. One of those Amtraks doing all the way across the airfield toward the Jap lines. Them ain't Amtraks, they're Nip tanks, he said. Shell bursts appeared among the enemy tanks. Some of our Sherman tanks had arrived at the edge of the airfield on our left and opened fire. Because of the clouds of dust and the shell fire, I couldn't see much and didn't see any enemy infantry, but the firing on our left was heavy. Word came for us to deploy on the double. The riflemen formed a line at the edge of the scrub along a trail and lay prone, trying to take what cover they could. From the beginning to the end on Peleliu, it was all but impossible to dig into the hard coral rock, so the men piled rocks around themselves or got behind logs and debris. Snafu and I set up our 60mm mortar a few yards behind them, across the trail in a shallow crater. Everyone got edgy as the order came. Stand by to repel counterattack. Counterattack hitting I Company's front. I didn't know where Company I was, but I thought it was on our left, somewhere. Although I had great confidence in our officers and NCOs, it seemed to me that we were alone and confused in the middle of a rumbling chaos, with snipers everywhere and with no contact with any other units. I thought all of us would be lost. They need to get some more damn troops up here, growled Snafu, his standard remark in a tight spot. Snafu set up the gun, and I removed an HE, high-explosive, shell from a canister in my ammo bag. At last we could return fire. Snafu yelled, "Fire!" Just then a Marine tank to our rear mistook us for enemy troops. As soon as my hand went up to drop the round down the tube, a machine gun cut loose. It sounded like one of ours, and from the rear of all places. As I peeped over the edge of the crater through the dust and smoke and saw a Sherman tank in a clearing behind us, the tank fired its 75mm gun off to our right rear. The shell exploded nearby, around a bend in the same trail we were on. I then heard the report of a Japanese field gun located there as it returned fire on the tank. Again I tried to fire, but the machine gun opened up as before. "Sledgehammer, don't let him hit that shell. We'll all be blown to hell," said a worried ammo carrier crouched in the crater near me. "Don't worry, that's my hand he just about hit," I snapped. Our tank and the Japanese field gun kept up their duel. "By God, when that tank knocks out that Nip gun, he'll swing his 75 over this-a-way, and it'll be our ass. He thinks we're Nips," said a veteran in the crater. "Oh, Jesus!" someone moaned. A surge of panic rose within me. In a brief moment, our tank had reduced me from a well-trained, determined assistant mortar gunner to a quivering mass of terror. It was not just that I was being fired at by a machine gun that unnerved me so terribly, but that it was one of ours. To be killed by the enemy was bad enough. That was a real possibility I had prepared myself for. But to be killed by mistake by my own comrades was something I found hard to accept. It was just too much. An authoritative voice across the trail yelled, "Secure the mortar!" A volunteer crawled off to the left, and soon the tank ceased firing on us. We learned later that our tankers were firing on us because we had moved too far ahead. They thought we were enemy support for the field gun. This also explained why the enemy shelling was passing over and exploding behind us. Tragically, the Marine who saved us by identifying us to the tanker was shot off the tank and killed by a sniper. The heavy firing on our left had about subsided, so the Japanese counterattack had been broken. Regrettably, I hadn't helped at all because we were pinned down by one of our own tanks. Some of us went along the trail and looked at the Japanese field gun. It was a well-made, formidable-looking piece of artillery, but I was surprised that the wheels were the heavy wooden kind, typical of field guns of the 19th century. The Japanese gun crew was sprawled around the piece. "Them's the biggest nips I ever saw," one veteran said. "Look at them sons of bitches. They's all over 6 foot tall," said another. "That must be some of that flower of the Guandun army we've been hearing about," put in a corporal. The Japanese counterattack was no wild, suicidal banzai charge, such as Marine experience in the past would have led us to expect. Numerous times during D-Day, I heard the dogmatic claim by experienced veterans that the enemy would banzai. "They'll pull a banzai and we'll tear their ass up. Then we can get the hell off of this hot rock, and maybe the CG will send the division back to Melbourne." Rather than a banzai, the Japanese counter-thrust turned out to be a well-coordinated tank infantry attack. Approximately 1 company of Japanese infantry, together with about 13 tanks, had moved carefully across the airfield until annihilated by the Marines on our left. This was our first warning that the Japanese might fight differently on Peleliu than they had elsewhere. Just before dusk, a Japanese mortar concentration hit 3-5's command post. Our CO, Lieutenant Colonel Austin C. Schaffner, was hit while trying to establish contact among the companies of our battalion. He was evacuated and put aboard a hospital ship. Schaffner had assumed command of the 3-5 before the Peleliu campaign. Not only was he highly respected, but his men considered him someone special. As a captain, he had survived the fighting on Corregidor, been captured by the Japanese, escaped, and had returned to combat. He came back to the division later and commanded the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines on Okinawa. He retired from the Corps as a brigadier general. Companies I, K, and L couldn't regain contact before nightfall. Each dug in a circular defense for the night. The situation was precarious. We were isolated, nearly out of water in the terrible heat, and ammunition was low. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt, accompanied by only a runner, came out into that pitch-dark, enemy-infested scrub, located all the companies, and directed us into the division's line on the airfield. He should have won a Medal of Honor for that feat. Walt was the executive officer of the 5th Marines when the battle for Peleliu began. He remained with 3-5 for a few days as its commanding officer until a replacement was named. A combat Marine in the truest sense, Walt had served with the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal and at Cape Gloucester. He had won the Navy Cross for heroism. He went on to serve in the Korean War and later in Vietnam, where as a lieutenant general he commanded the 3rd Marine Amphibious Corps for nearly 2 years. He retired as a general after serving as assistant commandant of the Marine Corps.
This ends Disc 3.